This is a revision lecture on Peter Skrzynecki's poetry for Unit 4 VCE English. The first thing we need to pay attention to with Skrzynecki's poetry, I think, is the title of his collection, Old/New World. Essentially, what this means is Old and/or New World. So we have to ask ourselves, what is the relationship like between old worlds and new worlds? Because this is at the heart of Skrzynecki's poetry. I think in every single poem you can find an aspect of the old world or the new world, or especially the connection between the two, and how those two manifest themselves in different situations in the lives of the characters and of the persona. Before thinking about this in a lot of detail, and before trying to locate or trying to identify and trying to explore this in the poetry, I think it's worth connecting to what our understanding of the world is, or what is a world. Of course, there is the world, which is a physical location, a physical setting that has natural features, physical features, people, groups, cultures, institutions. So you can think of it that way. But I think it's also important to think of a world as someone's subjective place, someone's subjective experience, the realm in which someone or a group of people or a culture inhabits. So we need to think about the things that aren't just physical, but also the symbolic. In our worlds, in our personal worlds, in the worlds in which we inhabit each and every single day, whether at home or whether at school or elsewhere, or thinking about all those as one kind of society, there are different things that we attribute meaning to, and those things become symbols in our lives. I think it's also worth considering that in a world, there are metaphysical and existential aspects, so identities, and places that people attach meaning to. The way that people think about certain places is not the same as others, and that's shaped by who they are and their beliefs. And of course, when you inhabit a certain world, you also take on a certain identity. And obviously, in a world, you need to consider the people, groups, cultures, and institutions that are there. So it's worth thinking about carefully for yourself what a world is. Because without understanding that concept of a world, it's impossible to think about the relationship between an old world and a new world. So there's an important distinction in the title. Old and new world, existing together, being present but in opposition, coexisting. Can old and new worlds coexist? Is it possible for them to be in the same place at the same time? And in what form do they come in? In what form is their presence felt, or realized, or manifest? You might consider it also in these terms, old or new world. So does someone have to make a choice in terms of picking a world to exist in, or a world to accept, or a world to imagine themselves in? Can you have both or not? So as you read his poetry, it's worth thinking about this relationship between old worlds and new worlds and the different aspects of them, and how, for example, in a poem like Postcard, the old world is a presence even within the new. So some key contextual knowledge that shapes our understanding of Skrzynecki's poetry. This is important because without this, it's hard to understand the impact of this poetry. It's also hard to understand the lives of the people and the characters within his poetry as well. So the first thing that we need to know is that refugees were forcefully displaced and thrown into diaspora because of war. We know that Skrzynecki's poetry and his personal immigration, his parents' immigration, happened after World War II. So none of these people were necessarily voluntarily moving to Australia. A lot of them had their homes destroyed, or their home countries were in a state where it wasn't hospitable anymore. The living conditions weren't as such, and that people would want to stay there, and there was probably a lack of stability, especially in Eastern Europe, which is where Poland is. So they're forcefully displaced and they're thrown into diaspora, which is a word that means essentially being forced out of your country or your place of origin because of war. So I think this is why a lot of the characters, especially Skrzynecki's parents, seek to recreate their old world and old lives in their new country, because they didn't choose necessarily to leave it behind, and so they carry it with them. Now, we also should know that immigration policies in Australia at the time allowed white foreigners into Australia. So the immigration into Australia wouldn't have been possible without some legal frameworks and government policies. It created a mass migration of different people groups and cultures that entered into Australia. So a lot of it is the reason why there are so many Italians and Greeks in Australia, and also people of different origins, because of this mass migration. Now, unsurprisingly, because of this, there's a lack of familiarity, a lack of empathy and sympathy from the locals, and we see that pretty evidently in some of his poetry. It also explains the difficulty of integrating or assimilating. Again, if we link that to being forcefully displaced, whilst they have to move to a new country, or they feel like they have to, the difficulty there is really, what do they leave behind, and how do they feel about leaving things behind? So I think for us, because most of us have lived in Australia all of our lives, we underestimate the difficulty of entering into a new world and establishing some sort of identity. So it's important as you read the poems to withhold any judgment in terms of whether or not, for example, Peter Skrzynecki's father, Felix, whether he should have embraced assimilation more. Why did he choose to hold on to his old traditions when he's in a new place? Well, we need to invite ourselves and realize that we need to have some empathy for these people. And that's really key to understanding the poetry. And it's really key to understanding the difficulties, the struggles, but also the possibilities that immigrants and refugees face when moving into a new place. So therefore, it's important for us to appreciate their desire to establish their own community. Whereas instinctively, I think we underappreciate it because we've never had to do that. So take it for what it is and don't judge it. Let it be what it is. Now, another aspect of the context of writing, which is important for us to consider, is the generational gap between Skrzynecki and his parents. I think that this was created because when Skrzynecki moved over to Australia, he was still a child, and therefore he wasn't really formed as a person. He wasn't really mature. He hadn't grown up with certain European sensibilities and traditions, but his parents had. And therefore we see this generational gap between him and his parents. And I think that's evident, and it should be obvious to us as you read the poems, but just connect it to your own lives for a second. You probably have some sort of generational gap between you and your parents. It's not dissimilar to the one that Skrzynecki has with his parents. We can't assume that just because they were immigrants that they were all always on the same page. Now, despite this, it's important to realize that Skrzynecki has a deep admiration for his parents, even though his relationship with them is not necessarily what we would call close or intimate, especially with his father. So this is an excerpt from an interview with Skrzynecki, where he received the Order of Australia medal, and he gives a really interesting answer here. So he's asked what the honor means to him, and he says, well, the obvious answer is that it's an honor, but it's something that I've felt really belongs more to my parents than to myself. And so we get a sense immediately that he admires them. He admires them for what they did. They are the ones who made the sacrifices. They went without so I could have a good education. I also think my parents belong to that generation of immigrants who lived behind what I call the grey suburban piling fences. They worked hard all their lives, died without leaving debts, contributed to Australia in a very honourable way, but never had medals pinned to their chests. They died unknown, so I think the honour really belongs to them. And apologies, that's paling, not polling. So there's a real sense of admiration there, but what I find interesting is in that answer, he doesn't speak with great intimacy, and it doesn't seem like he talks about his parents in a super personal manner, but he does honour them, and he does admire them. We'll see later that there is a bit of a disconnect between Skrzynecki and his parents, which is really evident in his poems, and really key, I think, to understand what it's like to grow up in Australia and for your parents to be migrants, and what that tension and relationship is like. Now, the last thing in this particular section of the lecture is I think we need to realize that Skrzynecki's poems, yes, are personal. You should have noticed that already. But we can also take them to be commentary on early immigrant life. Now, we know that Skrzynecki's poems are personal because he uses I as the pronoun quite a lot. And we can also imagine him being in those moments where he's observing his parents or where he is encountering some sort of experience as an immigrant. So Skrzynecki often inserts himself into the narrative, and therefore it's easy for us to talk about how Skrzynecki's poetry is all about him. But I think it's important, especially when you get essay topics that want you to focus on specific themes, to consider how the poems are a commentary on early immigrant life in general, not just for Skrzynecki. Now, his poems are almost all anecdotal. Even Felix Skrzynecki, which is a poem about his father, in the final stanza he inserts himself into the narrative. Now, we can read the poems in a more detached way, as a commentary on what it was like for immigrants in general. For example, in Migrant Hostel, or Immigrants at Central Station, or The Polish Immigrant, it's not just talking about Skrzynecki there. Even though he was in that experience, we have to consider that there are obviously other migrant families and migrants in those situations. And if you consider the fact that probably at Migrant Hostel he was a child of a very young age, it's not possible that he could have imagined or remembered everything in such vivid detail. So you'd have to consider that there's a bit of poetic license there. There's a bit of, he's taking a few liberties, but for good reason as well, to encapsulate the experience of these immigrants and give them voice as well.